So, last time we talked about this several steps in Rousseau's argument, right? If you remember, Rousseau is giving an argument for why a collective, a society, can be a moral entity of its own. He's very explicit about that, right? He says the community as a whole becomes a public person with a moral entity with its own will and so forth and so on. And he thinks that happens, and it only happens, if that society is based on the general will. So governed on the basis of the general will, or founded on what he calls the social contract. So it has to do with the kind of freedom that's obtainable, he thinks, only in society, that type of society. So that freedom has two parts, independence and autonomy. And he has a claim about why independence and autonomy are guaranteed by the social contract. Independence is guaranteed because we have to fully submit ourselves to the authority of the community, to its rules, its laws, which means that everybody is equally subject, so no person has sort of particular standing or authority to tell others what to do or to tell the community how it should behave. That's independence. And then he says autonomy is going to be given to you by the general will, because the general will is going to be what shapes the law. And the general will is just by definition, he says, it's that part over all of our several wills that is the true and autonomous part as it overlaps for public affairs. Right? And so then that's the argument, right? The one thing we haven't seen quite yet is why Rousseau thinks that a democracy will always be governed by the general will. That's the last part. Right? So if it was governed by the general will, and we believe that such a thing exists, then he's going to have his autonomy part established too, and the argument goes through, right? So why does he believe then that the general will really is going to be in charge? And the argument here, as I summarize it, has 9 steps. Right? So it has to do with the particular things that democracy makes you do. So Rousseau thinks that by living in a democracy, by having to behave as a voter in a democracy, a democratic citizen, you're forced to behave in such a way that your will, the will that you act upon, that part of your will, which if you remember has these parts, right? It has the good parts and the bad parts. The bad parts, the biases or the weaknesses or the addictions and so on, the temptations. And then there's the true autonomous rational will, if you will. And so he says a democracy, democratic deliberation and voting is going to force you to, at least as far as public affairs goes, as politics goes, to be acting on the true rational, informed, autonomous part. Okay? You're going to be moved by that part because you cannot get away with acting on the crappier parts, the weaker part, the suspicious part, the not so pretty part, and so on. All right. So that's basically what he thinks, right? Why? Okay, here. He thinks, look, in a democracy, the kind of democracy he has in mind, remember, is one in which everybody gets to vote, and it's not just a simple majority rule, but it has to be a unanimity rule, right? So a law doesn't get accepted unless everybody involved accepts it. So what kind of law is going to be accepted? Well, the one that everybody can see as giving them good reasons. You know? Something everyone can accept. Everyone is agreeable. It's agreeable to everybody. So, well, if that's going to be true, then you're going to have to propose a policy, right, that is acceptable to all. Well, if that's going to be true, then it must appeal to reasons that everyone can share, right? Not just reasons for me, but reasons for you and you and you for everybody, right? It has to be in it something for everybody to say yes. Now here's this is a point that he's trying to make. I'm putting it here in somewhat technical terms, but so think about like proper names like my name, you know, like or your name, like Jeff, right? That's a proper name. Or a rigged definite description. You might think sort of like I won't use a name, but it might define a term in such a way that doesn't involve, but that still singles out a person. So think about it this way, right? Like you might say a law might, for example, be discriminatory when it says Catholics don't get to enjoy freedom of religion. Right? Catholics is a proper name. It's not Jeff, but it's Catholics, right? It's a bigger group, not just one person. So that's a proper name. And he said, well, Rousseau says, how is that policy going to fare? Well, in a society with Catholics, it's not going to be accepted, right? Because Catholics are going to say, wait a minute, I want religious freedom just as much as the others. So no, right? That law gets knocked out.
So basically, no discrimination can be shown inside that law against anyone.
Right, so he thinks, like, in a democracy, you can't really pass a discriminatory law because the people whom that law will discriminate against, they have a vote. And they're going to say no. Right? So if I say, black people don't get to vote anymore after today, right? And black people are going to say no, right? So you can't pass. So the point is, like, in general, Rousseau thinks anything that contains a proper name, like Jeff or me or Catholics or black people or whoever, right? None of that's going to go through because the people who are singled out by that are going to say, I don't accept that, and it has to be acceptable to all. Right? Now, Rick definite descriptions is basically a technical term like this. I might, of course, put it this way, right? I say, like, okay, well, maybe Catholics not. So, let's say that I want to go after Jews instead of Catholics, right? And I say, Jews can't, okay, that's not going to happen, but I say, I won't actually use the name Jews. I'll just say, like, people who have a day of rest on, what is it, Saturday or Friday? I never know. Saturday, right? Saturday, right? The Sabbath? Friday is the dinner, right? And then right. So Saturday, right? Everyone who has the day of rest, the holiday of rest on Saturday, they cannot have any freedom of religion. No proper name involved, right? But that's still not going to work because I'm rigging my description, right? It's a description that singles out them, right? And so I could do that similarly, right? I might say, like, the person who lives on 29 Main Street, whatever, right, doesn't get to vote anymore, right? That might be just you, right? So I don't say you, but I'm describing it in exactly, it's very impartial. Anyone who lives on that, no, of course, right? So that too is not going to fly because the person living on 29 Main Street or the Jews are going to say it still singles me out. So any one of these type of laws that are really like discriminatory against a particular group of persons or a particular person, they're all going to be filtered out. Anthony?
I feel like nothing would ever get done. And it's like where our Senate is going through, like all these people have different beliefs. I feel like nothing would ever be accomplished.
All right. Can we hold off on that for 1 second? So it's a good question, right? Because the structure of this argument is this, right? Like Rousseau, if you remember, says, like, your will has a whole bunch of stuff in it, good stuff and bad stuff, right? And the argument is supposed to show that democratic decision-making starts culling, right, the bad stuff. You can't get away with this type of bad stuff, right? And you're already thinking ahead. You're saying, well, okay, well, if we get rid of the bad stuff, maybe we actually get rid of all the stuff and there's nothing left, right? We can't make any decisions anymore where we agree. Now, Rousseau thinks otherwise. It's not clear that he has good reason to think otherwise. But let's go through this first, and then we'll get back to your... all right, so we put this together, right? So it has to accept the reasons all can share. The reasons all can share cannot identify particular groups, either by naming them or just describing them in some roundabout way, etc. And so, cannot happen, right? Cannot have that kind of a policy proposal. All right. Now here comes the connection to our wills, right? Why would we want to do these things, right? Like, why would you want to involve these type of law? Like, why would we want to propose these type of policies that single out particular groups? Well, it's the bad part, right? It's it's our biases against certain people, against certain groups, certain religions. It's our fear. It's our whatever, what have you, right? Why might I say the opposite? Why might I not try to discriminate against a group, but sort of discriminate in favor of a group, right? I might say, every person in our society born on January 8th, 1979, from here on out gets $1 million, right? I'm very happy about that policy because that's my birthday. So, that's not a fair or a negative, right? But that's greediness, right? Like, I'm just trying to... laziness, maybe. I'm trying to make a buck. Like, I'm trying to, without actually, several ways. Without actually having to work for it, right? I want you to pay my bills for me. Right? So that's anyway, that won't work either, right? Because the only way I can actually propose a law that's going to benefit me at the expense of you is by proposing a law that somehow singles me out at the expense of you, right? And you're going to object to that. That was what he's thinking. And so policy proposals acceptable to all, right? Anything democratically acceptable, that means. Cannot be based on anything like that, these kind of biases, these pluses and minuses. None of the crappy parts of your will. All right, so we've already seen this, but here's just a formal statement of it. So democratic decision-making, at least Rousseau style, guarantees, by the structure of it, that policies won't, like that they're acceptable to all citizens. So it's just 5 and 6 together, right? And then the general will reflects people's wills without their biases, so therefore democratic decision-making captures the general will. Or, as the term these days is called, public reason by philosophers, or more commonly, the common good. And that's the good part. That's your argument for why democratic decision-making will, if it happens, reflect only the general will, which is the overlap of all of our good, like the real reasons that we all share, not our bad parts. And then, now we have the argument complete, right? Because general will, if we live under the general will alone, then we're going to be free. And here's why. All right, so back to you, Anthony. So you said, so this is why nothing but the general will can go through, right? And you're questioning about whether we haven't actually thrown out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, right? We've thrown out all the bad parts, but also we might say nothing but the general will is going to go through, but maybe not even the general will is going to go through, if there is such a thing. Maybe there is no general will. Right? What do you think someone like Rousseau might say about that?
Might say about what?
In response to Anthony's worry. Like Anthony says, how is anything ever going to get done? Well,
anything else that wasn't true and rational, like then that would probably be the thing that would throw them out. That's why it would go to the general will. So if it's not true and rational, it won't work.
Right. But that's just a negative argument, right? That's just going to show why certain things don't get accepted. But I thought your question was one further about why would anything get accepted, right? Like, so, okay, we know why the bad laws are not going to get accepted in Rousseau's society, apparently. But that doesn't mean there's going to be any good laws, right? The result might just be no laws at all. I thought that was what you were worrying about.
You know how different communities are fighting about was it like oil digging and stuff? It's like where
about what?
Was it where they're digging into the ground for the oil and stuff? I can't remember the call. But like you have like 2 different communities that are fighting against each other, then nothing will get done. Because like you have different ideas, like Democrats and Republicans, nothing ever gets done.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I'm kind of wondering.
Right. So, what do you think Rousseau would say about that? Yeah, Laura?
I think a lot of what you're talking about is controlled by biases. So he would say that that wouldn't happen because the laws would be made out of the good parts and not the biases. The biases would not dominate everything. I feel like that's kind of maybe.
Right. It could be. Yeah. So one suggestion might be that these type of problems are often the result of like certain interest group lobbying, whether they be oil companies or gas companies, whoever we're talking about, hole digging companies, or environmentalists for that reason, right? Like for maybe whoever you want to side with, but there are different groups that are lobbying pretty hard for or against it, and they might hold each other in gridlock in a representative system because they have money to give to politicians, or they have votes that they can swing in an election and so on, right? Because they have a membership that's very loyal, and so on and so forth. But, of course, Rousseau is going to say, well, I'm going to live in a direct democracy, not a representative one, so there's not going to be politicians for these interest groups. So they must actually convince the individual voters themselves, and they now have to weigh up, right? Like, is this worth the cost or not?
So you'd be saying like a collective vote?
Yeah.
And but Rousseau also, I mean, he's saying though that he talks about the legislator, right? And how they don't know what it's like to be the common man, but they know what he needs somehow. I just didn't really get that, but so it's up to the legislator to educate the...
Well, for Rousseau, remember, has in mind like cities of Geneva of his time, right? That's the level at which he's thinking.
Right.
So he's thinking about literally, like if you're a citizen, you show up to vote. So it's not you vote once every 4 years for a politician, you go home and carry on with your life. Like every time there's a political decision to make, you show up and you talk about it and you spend a day on it or something. So it's going to be a lot more involved, a lot more work.
Yeah.
But then, of course, he thinks that's good, right? Because this is a kind of like an enlightening experience. It's like it's developing your will, training your will to be more rational, less biased, and so on. So it's educational.
Yeah, right.
So did we say that Rousseau would go against his argument that nothing would get done by the elimination of biases?
Yeah, more or less.
Oh, okay.
Now, I'm not trying to say that that's the knockdown argument, right? Because there's still, it's still a very optimistic idea, right? So think about the case that was it fracking? Was that what you had in mind? No, yeah. So there are different values at stake here, right? So there's money on the table, right? There's jobs on the table. There's actually, fracking has been the thing that has been a major contributor to the U.S. reducing its CO2 emissions over the last few years. So there's global warming concerns. Like fracking has been very good for global warming, no matter what all the other troubles it might have caused. But so that's on the table. Then there's all the other troubles, right? There's fear of earthquakes, and there might be other type of polluting problems, and so on. Landscapes get this or whatever. So there's a whole bunch of values there on the table. Rousseau seems to think that if we just think about this and talk about this long enough, there is a right answer about fracking that we will converge upon. Right? That is acceptable to everybody. And that's I think a lot of people think that's a pretty lofty assumption, right? It might just be that you and I weigh the different values very differently. Like you put more stock in the environment than I do. I put more stock in unemployment than you do or something. Right? And there's no way we can talk until the cows come home, but we're never going to agree on that. Right? If that's true, then there is no one answer to what to do. Right? And if there's no one answer to what to do, then given that we all have a veto, we're just not going to get there. So it might be that there is a lot of laws that just don't pass. Maybe there's some that we could get through. Right? So, bloody murder might be illegal. Okay, we can all accept that. Right? Child molestation, we can all accept that. Right? So there's a bunch of sort of low-hanging fruit maybe we can all agree on. But like fracking is that's complicated, but it's not the it's not this most complicated part of the law. So, pretty soon we might hit situations where we won't be able to solve it. Yeah, and Rousseau seems to think that by this educating thing we will become more like a community, and our wills will converge more, and it'll be all harmonious and maybe not. Right?
I just noticed this argument. Apart from premise 2 being iffy and such, it's technically not valid and the issue is when it hits premise 5. It's because the issue is before our biases motivate us to include proper names.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that doesn't follow. Then that next line, therefore, policy proposals acceptable to all cannot contain any biases. The only let me explain that. I've read it before.
You can find the spot. Yeah.
P. That's our. I shouldn't do conditional. That's our biases. Why don't I just do B for that? That makes more sense. That's our biases. Biases motivate us to include proper names. Let's see. I should have written this down there before I came up there because I had it mapped out in my head.
If you're thinking about I'm playing fast and loose here, right? Because I thought 9 was enough. is the motivators to include jump to contain the thing that's messing you up? I mean, so strictly speaking, that's not. I mean, it's not supposed to be formal. If you want to be want to be a stickler for formally valid arguments, then you cannot. I mean, there's an ambiguity between include and contain, right? So that might be. So I'd have to put like somewhere between 4A, B, C, whatever, like to do a little sub-argument. But I can get there.
I mean, it was
Is it something else that you were?
I think it's more of. I just think it too is iffy, but
Sure, yeah. I mean,
noticed
that's
that if
yeah.
you formalize it, it doesn't. It doesn't work if you formalize it.
Well, this is just by substitution, right? So, policy proposal acceptable to all cannot contain proper names. So, if the idea is that these proper names, etc., are somewhat, one way or another, equivalent to biases, then you can substitute that clause by biases.
Oh, well, that's not what that says. It's equivalent to.
Right. So I'm trying to. I mean, you'd have to make the case that they're essentially equivalent, which would require a whole bunch of another slide. But I thought.
Well, that would be an important detail for that to work, though.
Sure. Yes. I'm trying to lay out the way that Rousseau, I think, is trying to construct his argument here, which is he takes him a book, and I'm trying to put it on there. Anyway. Either way, whether or not there are going to be any policies that are acceptable to all, this is Rousseau's argument for why no biased or no, even bias is my term, right? I'm trying to, no pluses and minuses, whatever the things in our wills that are the non-autonomous parts of our wills. Those will be rooted out by the democratic decision making. Because all of the non-autonomous parts of your wills are going to be parts that other people are going to have reasons to object to. And that's the general thought here. And you can't get anything passed that other people have reason to object to. Notice that there's a variety of things here that are peculiar about Rousseau's idea about democracy, right? So like your standard log rolling idea, like that we see in our politics a lot, where a representative from one district will vote in favor of, say, putting an army base in another district, in exchange for the other representative voting in favor of a subsidy for the first representative's district, right? So they'll do and then of course the rest of the country is paying the bill, right? So, but is it that kind of log rolling? Is like, I'll help you out to get a majority on your preferred thing, that even though if I just looked at it, on its own, I would be against, because it costs my voters money. But if you help me then get a benefit for my voters, then I'll vote in favor, and vice versa. And so that's how a lot of policies get accepted.
That's what log rolling is.
Yeah, so political scientists call that log rolling. So it's like, I don't know why. Honestly, I don't know. But anyway, people they will line up behind policies that they don't want to accept themselves in exchange for a certain favor later on. Yeah, Reggie.
So with that being said, you use that example, and I'm going to take it to today's time. Does that mean, because that goes on so much in government now, as far as one state helping other states for exchange, favors, and trade-off, does the general will does it really exist in society if everybody's not benefiting from it, or if everybody's not getting something from a piece of the pie?
Right.
Or is it just...
Well, the general will can exist even if politicians aren't acting on it, right? So...
still represent the majority. Even like that example he was giving about the legislator, because I had trouble with that too, as far as the legislator is supposed to represent the people, but he's supposed to pull himself like he's not one of the people. So how can he represent the people if he's not one of he has to pull himself from their feelings, identity, and everything else? That's what I thought.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, right? So, Rousseau, in some sense, thinks that when the people come together and form a general will, that itself becomes a new entity, right? So it's true that if the politicians are going to be really acting on the general will, they're going to be acting on a will that's not really any individual person's will at all. It's sort of the overlap of the enlightened parts of their individual will, right? But that's not our will. That's only a part of our will, right? Like you and I have many other parts to our wills. Some good but private, but some not so good, right? Private or public. And so, yeah, that stuff is going to be separate. So the thing you're bringing up, I think, maybe is if it's not going to be literally us on the square voting on things, but it's going to be representatives, for this to work, we need pretty enlightened or special people, right? Like people who can sort of set their own private things and wills aside and embody this higher enlightened shared will. And you might, yeah. So modern day, like today, when you talk to Rousseauians who like a form of representative democracy, they will be much more optimistic about that than, by the sounds of it, you will be. Of course, there's a story that they can tell, right? They can tell stuff about how maybe if we increase political participation of people, we can have a type of constraints on politicians that will force them in that direction, right? Maybe if you have various laws that restrict the access of lobbying or interest group stuff, or whatever, that are polluting that process, maybe that's a way in which we can get closer to that. You know, that's what motivates a lot of these people's proposals in that direction. But it's, yeah, you should wonder, like maybe we're chasing a ghost there, right? So it's an optimistic. There is definitely a kind of optimism about it, maybe utopianism about it, right? All right, so let's go on. Let's step back, right? So we've seen all the arguments. If he succeeds, right, then we're going to see that this is following is true. If you're not living in a society with a social contract, then no one is truly free. Because true freedom means independence and autonomy, and that's only guaranteed by the social contract, he says. So in our society, we are not truly free, right? Because we do not live in a society based on the social contract. We have a constitution that sets that, the Declaration of Independence declares certain inalienable natural rights. The Constitution is supposed to protect some of those, and that's a problem with those things. You can't have that. That means that some people can restrict the community's will by their own wills, right? By saying, my rights are being violated, community, you cannot do that, which means that you all are going to be independent on me if I'm the person doing that. Right? If you're not independent, then you're not free. So, go.
Isn't the social contract like constitution?
Yeah, it could be like it's like a constitution, but it's it could be a founding document, right? Like, so strictly speaking, constitutions are thought of as documents that don't have to be founding documents. And what a constitution usually does, at least the American one, is the constitution doesn't tell you like what you can or cannot do, right? The constitution tells you what the government cannot do. Right? So like, Congress shall pass no law that, right? That's what the usual clause is, like Article 1, for example, right? Establishing a religion or something. Right? So it says government cannot establish a religion. There's actually only one clause in the Constitution that tells you what you cannot do, and it is you can't hold any slaves. Understand? All the other ones are, and that was added way later, unfortunately, but still, that was added way later. Cannot force you to testify again, in your own case, and so on. So that stuff in the social contract does not exist, right? Because there can be no limit to what the community or the general will can do.
And there is really no government?
No, there is. The government is all of us together. Right?
Right.
So, I mean, for like daily activities and stuff, we might appoint officers, but the sovereign, the person, like the actual power, is you and me and all of us together. Right? So popular sovereignty, that's that idea, right? That ultimately the power is with the people. You get that. That's the purest version you get here in Rousseau. And the term really traces back in some ways to Rousseau.
And they're free from the social contract.
Yes, because there are no limits to government, there are no limits to what we all together can do. And that means that we're not depending on anyone who tells us what we can and cannot do. Rousseau thinks like ultimately these powers and these limits, they come from people. So if the Constitution says, you people, that includes you as an individual, right, you cannot establish a state religion, well, who's telling you that? Right? Somebody is telling you that. Well, that person or that group of persons are now in power over you. So you're dependent on them. It's up to you. You should choose that. You should be free, literally free, to choose whether or not you want to establish a state. Now, you're probably not going to get away with it, right? But that's the beauty of the social contract. But we can't have a limit on it, because if there's limits, there is some higher authority over you. So no constitution in the sense of restrictions. In principle,
Make their own laws altogether,
all the time. Yeah.
and everybody has to be okay with that.
Right. And so Rousseau assures you, right? So last time I think we talked about it when he has these passages where, maybe 2 times ago, he says, it'll be all right, because everyone has a vote. It's not like, since everybody is equally subject to the law, it's in nobody's interest to pass any particularly burdensome law. So he's saying like, don't be afraid, it'll be fine. Right?
Yeah, everybody's rights will be gone because
Right.
all bound to the law.
And we have to convince other people that it's a good idea, and so you can't propose any crappy ideas. Well, you can't propose them, you're just not going to get anywhere. All right, so that's the negative part, right? If you don't have a social contract, so you don't have this full surrender, you have a constitution, or you live just in a feudal society or whatever, you're going to be dependent on someone, not free, and no autonomy without the democratic deliberation. Now, if you are living in a society with the social contract, therefore you're governed by the general will, then you're guaranteed to be free. It's not that you have a chance, it's a guarantee, he thinks. And so this is why he thinks when you force people into that type of society, then you're forcing them to be free, because it's just by definition, like that's what it is. And then here's like a truly democratic state is governed by the general will. So if you force people to live in a truly democratic state, then you're going to be rendering these people genuinely free. All right, we've seen that now. Back to self-determination, right? So this class is not about Rousseau's theory, right? It's not about democracy, it's not about freedom necessarily, although these things all have important roles to play in the ideas that we're discussing, right? Because as we will see throughout this term, the idea of self-determination is very, very closely linked in many, many people's minds to ideas about democracy, ideas about freedom, ideas about independence, right? In the decolonization movement after the Second World War, independence was the buzzword, and it was independence and self-determination. Rousseau thinks that self-determination is only possible when we live in a democracy, because only in a democracy we are actually ourselves determining the laws under which we live. That's why he thinks in a democracy you get this moral unit or entity that's created in a society. We'll see later, some people think that democracy is literally an exercise of individual autonomy. It's like your individual freedom is being exercised in the political sphere, just like your individual freedom is exercised in your personal sphere when you make your own free decisions. And so on. So all those ideas are very, very closely related, right? So the reason why we've looked so much at Rousseau is that all that traces back really to his thinking. In his thinking, you get the first clear, pure version of it. And we'll see later, like Altman and Wellman, for example, they try to get rid of certain parts of it, right? So the democracy worship, if you will, right, is gone. Altman and Wellman think it's exaggerated, right? They don't give an argument against it, but they're just not that impressed. But they do hold on to an idea of value about living under self-imposed rules, right? If you remember Altman and Wellman saying that early on when they give that a quick description of the right to self-determination, it's the right of a group or a state of a nation to order their own affairs as they see fit. Okay, why should we care about that? Well, you care about that if you believe that there is some value to living not under the will of some other group or some alien force or something. Right? If you think that self-determination, not other determination, independence, not dependence, that's the good thing. Right? So all that goes back. That goes back to the idea of Rousseau, in some form. So there's different ways you can try and capture it, but that's ultimately the heart of the theory here. All right. Does anyone have any questions at this point or not? Other than, can it be over? I promise you, Rousseau is the kind of philosopher who, every time you read him, he gets less annoying, I think. Some philosophers get more annoying as you read him. He's like maximally annoying the first time. Really, to me anyway, really annoying the first time, and every time I read him afterwards, I'm starting to get more intrigued by him. Not necessarily persuaded, but more intrigued. So, I don't know which one is better, but anyway. All right, so we got it?
Yeah.
All right. All right. A couple more summarizing points, right? So, just a couple of quotes here to give context again to where you find these ideas in Rousseau. So, Rousseau takes this idea of the state, that freedom is possible only in the state, quite literally. So, here's some quotes, right? You've seen this: the passage from the state of nature, so that's before we live under government, to the civil state when we live under government, produces a very remarkable change in man, or woman, that's just mankind. By substituting justice, so that's the good parts, right? That's the noble part of your will, the part that wants justice, over instinct, which is the part that like I want to win or something, right? In your conduct. So this is he thinks this is like once we have to go through all this democratic stuff, you will be made the better for it. He takes that literally. Actually, he thinks, that's the lofty part, the utopian part. And so what you acquire in the civil state is moral liberty, which alone makes you a true master of yourself. Autonomous, right? True master of yourself. Not trying to be a master of somebody else, because you remember early on in the book, he says when you try to boss around other people, you're a greater slave than they are. Why? Because you're a slave to your temptations, your biases, and so on. The only thing that makes you want to deny their equality is that you have some type of obsession with showing your superiority. You're not superior, you're an equal, morally speaking. So you're enslaved to that crappy part in you that you cannot survive. Once you are forced to live in a society where you're truly equal to them, you'll be acting upon the good part of you, and you'll be a true master of yourself, and only yourself. The mere impulse of appetite is slavery, right? So, like the addict. The addict is a slave to their addiction. The addiction is in control, not they are. Well, obedience to law, which we prescribe to ourselves, is liberty. So he thinks true freedom is being a subject to the law and at the same time the author of the law. Right? That's what democracy gives you. So hence self-determination, right? There are rules. They determine what a society is like, but it's by yourself as a group. All right. And then this we've already seen. He also takes very literally the idea that once all this happens, the unit, the collective, the community becomes something with a common identity, life and will of its own, a public person, a moral and collective body, and so forth and so on. So just to foreshadow the reading question, yes, that would be a version of the Hegelian myth. So, two important points about self-determination moving forward. In the state, Rousseau thinks you're going to be independent and autonomous, right? Self-directing and not subject to somebody else. Now, of course, that will only work if the state itself is independent and autonomous, right? And so this is why in self-determination you get this external and internal parts, right? The internal part is the democratic part, which is the self-governing. And the external part is independence, right? So independence, not being colonized by other countries, not being invaded, annexed, and so on. So you can read these at your own leisure, but anyway, here is This one we've already seen, but here Rousseau is very explicitly saying that you cannot have a free society, a sovereign community, be subject to another one. Right? So when Brazil, to name a country at random, Brazil is colonized by Portugal, the possibility for freedom is thereby destroyed, Rousseau thinks. Why? Because now they're not independent anymore. Right? They're subject to the government of the Portuguese. Now maybe all Portuguese have votes, they actually didn't, but maybe they would. But the Brazilians are not self-determining and therefore not free. Okay? For them to be free, they have to cast off that yoke. Right. Note that these are two parts of the same idea, right? It's not this collectivist versus individual. It's not interpretations of the same idea. All right. I've got some questions here. You can think about these as you go along, but we're running out of time. So think about them for the exam and so on. If you want to talk about them, I'm happy to, but not right now. All right. So that was Rousseau. We're done with Rousseau. I want to talk to you for the rest of today about Nozick. We won't talk much about Tesson either. So let me see, where am I? We've seen before that there are two strands of thinking about self-determination. Right? The individualist idea, which picks up with one strand of Rousseau's thought, which is that your individual freedom, your individual autonomy, is what gives a society, sort of what together creates the collective, right, of the self-determining society. It's not strictly Rousseau's thought, but it's one strand in Rousseau's thought. And we'll see later, we'll read someone called Daniel Philpott. He says this stuff about democracy, for example. So democracy literally is, for him, the activity of governing yourself, exercising your autonomy in the political realm. Right? So he can have a simple argument for a right to self-determination. State self-determination is the joint exercise, so together, are exercised together by all citizens of their autonomy. People have a right to exercise their autonomy, at least as long as it doesn't harm the autonomy of others or something like that. And then you can have a simple argument for why the state has a right to self-determination. That's how someone like Philpott roughly thinks about it. Of course, Tesson, you know, doesn't like this, right? Tesson thinks autonomy, rights to autonomy are not rights to a state, they're right against the state, they protect you, and this is some type of perversion of that, but whatever. All right. To Nozick. Nozick has a little tale that I wanted you to think about. 9 steps, if I believe it. If I believe I got it right, 9 steps. I have a version of the tale in an argument, but can anyone give me, like, I don't know. Nozick is a philosopher. He's a very interesting guy, who was a very interesting guy. The tale comes from this little book, from a book, a very famous book, Anarchy, State and Utopia. It's a very famous book in political philosophy. Has a lot of notorious or controversial arguments in it, but he also has, in developing these arguments, sometimes he'll take a moment, a couple of pages, to just sort of throw out a little nugget to think about, and he won't really follow up on it. So, I know I copied very little for you. It's not that he comes with some explanation that I didn't share with you. That's it. He just goes on to the next topic. So, what he's doing, he's just challenging you. Sometimes he writes as if he doesn't know what to make of it. He just thinks it's something that he and maybe us should think about some more. So anyway, what do you think about well, let's start with describing the tale. Can anyone give me a quick description of what's going on in the tale? Someone else. You're very good. I like that, but I want other people to do that way too. Someone else. Someone who doesn't speak as much. You'll benefit from trying to describe it. You're a good guy too. I need some of the bad people too. Not bad. You know what I mean.
Yeah.
You're a bad person. No, joke. I don't know your name. What's your name? Lydia. Do you want to try? Yeah, you want to just try and explain to, just say what you think, what was going on in the tale.
So the first steps were about if you're a slave and your master had full control and was awful to you and beat you and things point in the stats he went from being like a full slave to just having like not all your freedoms, but not all their freedoms.
Right. Good. And so, what do you think is the like? What does that make you think about? Like, you know, does it raise any questions for you? Like, what? Except what's the point? Yeah, Chantal. Thanks, Bill.
I just feel like that the non-person total is that even though these communities born is towards the end they were showing like real democracy, like you can vote and that, and from point 1 to 9 is kind of the same, whereas democracy is just another form of slavery. You're still controlled, even if you might have, you know, more rights or you might be treated nicer, you're still controlled by individuals between 1 and 10,000. If they need you, they'll use you. If not, you're going about your way, but still your own individuality is
Right. Yeah, so it starts with being a full slave where you just have a master and you get beaten, right? And then he says, well, now, like imagine step 2, that the master is a little nicer, right? And then presumably the idea is, at the end, he asks whether you're still a slave or not, right? So presumably in step 1, you're a slave, right? Clearly. Like you're living in chains, you get beaten and so on. That's a slave, if there ever was one. Right? And then step 2 is a little nicer, and so then we should ask ourselves, well, from 1 to 2, did we move from not being a slave to being a slave? Like, from being a slave to being not a slave, right? So no, step 2 is still slaves, clearly, right? And then to 3, it's like whatever, like you get a couple of days off per week or something, right? It's just like 3 out of the 7 days you have to work, and then 4 out of the 7 days you get off. Then he says, well, actually, now you can just go into town, step 4, right, where you work for yourself, but he'll take 3 out of 7 of your, so it's basically the same, right? Like whatever a whole week's worth, before he said 3 days you're going to work for me, and the 4 days you can work for yourself, and now I'm going to tax you at, what is 3 7s, 17, what is it? 40, 51%? No, it's got to be less, 41%. So it's about, a little less. What's 1/7 is?
About 43.
43.
And then
7.
14.
I thought it was 17 for some reason. All right. So 43, you're going to be taxed at a 43% clip, 43% clip, right? So that's basically, he thinks, well, if you tax at a 43% clip, then 3 out of every $7 that you make are not yours. They're his to command. Now, have you become, is that the step that, no, looks maybe still like you're a slave, right? Because you're still a slave. You just get to work somewhere else, and he takes about almost half of your stuff. Right? Then he says, well, you're still a slave, but there's 10,001 of you, right? And he just gives the 10,000 the vote, but not you. And so are you now still a slave? Well, he thinks, well, it looks like you haven't been set free exactly, right? And on at all these points. All right, well, now the 10,000 still are in charge, but you get a vote, but only if there is an exact 5,000 tie, and then you become the tiebreaker, right? And then he says, well, actually, you just get a vote with the 10,000, and if it happens to be a 5,000 tie, then your vote will end up being the difference maker, but most of the time, not, right? So, of course, the idea is that he's trying to set out is, if step 1 is clearly a slave, if there ever was one, and the transition from 1 to 2 doesn't set you free, right? And this is a transition, if 2, if you're not free, then there's a transition from 2 to 3 setting you free. No, right? Well, if you're in 3 not free, and a transition from 3 to 4, is that setting you free? No, right? And so every step is not enough to say that this is a step at which we're liberated. And so, well, then if step 1 you were a slave, then you're never set free. And it seems that in step 9 you're still a slave, right? But step 9, that's us. And so that's the question, right? He's like saying, so what should we think about our situation? That's one way to think about the argument, by the way. I think there's another way. I think why Nozick isn't presenting it as, therefore, the democracy in which you live is like slavery. That's not his conclusion, right? His conclusion is to ask, what do you think? You're still a slave. Is anyone here convinced by it? Does anyone think, actually, yeah, we are enslaved by democracy? Yeah, Reggie?
Well, I think you don't. Well, I got you don't have a choice. You got choices. You have choices. Sometimes they matter. Sometimes they don't matter. But all in all, I mean, you still have choices because he said something about we gave him that one vote, but even with that one vote, it still came to a decision. So the one vote didn't matter.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's us, right? Like, so in our, like, if turns out, like, whatever, in a couple of months there's an election, right? Yeah. It turns out there's an exact, how many people vote, whatever, 100 million, right? So there's 100 million and one, right, vote. 50 million Trump, I know it doesn't work that way, but for, 50 million Trump, 50 million Clinton, then you are the one who decides, right? But that's never happened, literally never happened, and the odds of that happening are probably, philosophers have actually calculated the odds of winning Powerball jackpot is better than that happening. Like you can actually, so there are books that people go through the calculations of what the odds would be if that happened. You have a better chance. And Powerball lottery is like really, really unlikely, right? Like the odds of getting hit by lightning are better than that. That's literally true too. So not great, right? So lots of philosophers actually conclude from that, by the way, that voting is irrational. It's a waste of your time. Because the chances of your vote going to waste are way, way, way better than the chances that when you buy Powerball, you're wasting your dollar. Right? And way, way, way better than chances of walking out and not getting hit by lightning. Right? So that's not going to happen, right? Then, of course, the question is, all right, well, you effectively have no influence over the rules under which you have to live. They might be bad, like in the first step of the slave rule. Maybe they're very good. But we already saw that the slave master changing the rules from bad to good, that didn't free you. Right? So, well, if that's true, then for us, the fact that we live under good rules, I mean, thank heavens, but much better than if we lived in Zimbabwe or something where the rules are horrific. But, if we're thinking about whether we're free, and of course, remember, he's challenging, not directly by name, but it's this tradition in thinking. He's challenging Rousseau's tradition, right? Rousseau says, only in a democracy you'll be free. And we can force you into it. But Nozick here is thinking, well, wait a minute. Then what about these steps, right? Like, if I'm free in step 9, as Rousseau is claiming that I am, shouldn't there be a step where I transition from being a slave in 1 to being free in step 9? And he says, I can't see it. All right. Let's look at, so here's an version of the argument. So just to write it out, right? Like, suppose society is populated by people who are not free, or the slaves. 10,001 of them. But the number doesn't really matter. Right? Now, that's the first. Right? So that's just an assumption here. Imagine that. Now, if at no point, this is the second premise, if at no point the unfree slaves are actually set free, then they must remain unfree, right? Because supposedly setting free is what undoes your being unfree. Right? This we're just assuming to be true. This seems pretty true to me, right? At least in first glance, I think, yeah, it sounds right. So. And third, none of the steps in detail, 1 through 9, involves none. Yeah. I never know this. So grammatically, by the way, sorry. Grammatically, the subject is none, right? None is singular, but steps is plural. So I never know what the verb is going to be, like plural or singular. I know in Dutch it's clear. In Dutch it's singular. But involve. Yeah, that's intuitively I want to say involved, but none is singular, right? None is not a plural. So, I mean, the steps is the adjective is like, this is the subject and the verb is supposed to follow the subject. So, I know in Dutch it's very strict. None of the steps involves. But in America, people always say involve, and I'm confused. So I don't know. You don't know? You'd say involve?
Let me think about it.
But it's grammatically not, it cannot, like strictly, it cannot be correct, right?
Sounds like involved.
By the sound of it, you're from like northern England, is that right? What would you say in England? Involved? Yeah.
I'd say involved too.
Yeah?
Because we're talking about
Right.
the steps. None of the steps.
Right, but we're talking about, like,
None.
yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
Oh, no.
It's also weird to say that none is singular because it's nothing, it's not one, but anyway.
Yeah, nothing.
Anyway. All right, so that little aside. So then follows the slaves are still unfree at the end of the tale. Okay. So, but at the end of the tale, the slaves do live in a democracy, and then it follows, it seems, that people in a democracy, or democracies in just for short, are not free. Against Rousseau, right? Rousseau says that democracy guarantees, not just can, it guarantees you freedom. And here we see that democracies are not free.
Just to go off on your tangent again, if you had said it as, like, when you're talking about it in its entirety, it sounds like it'd make more sense to say involve. But if you said each of the steps, or each step, if you said
Right,
each
well, that-
step,
yeah,
then it
yeah.
would sound like you should say involves.
Right. But then we're changing step, which is that's going to be the key.
I'm saying like the way
You'd have to
you
keep
say
steps
all
constant
of
for
the
this to be...
steps involved. None of the steps involved. The steps involved.
How about one of the steps?
Each case for steps is plural.
Okay. Laura?
I just looked it up because,
Oh, yeah.
and it says that it's actually versatile, so it could be either. It's dependent upon the noun of, in the phrase, like some would be what you would look at, or steps would be what you would look at. So it would actually be involved because with steps you would use involved.
So if I say one of the steps...
Although it wouldn't be incorrect. They say it wouldn't be incorrect, though, if you said involved.
Yeah, I want to go for something. I say the opposite is incorrect.
Involved is correct.
Yeah.
This is what this says
I
in
know.
the grammar book, so I'm trusting it. Yeah.
I like my argument, though. I think kind of see it seems ironclad. And strange, so it's strange, right? So in different languages, in Dutch, it's the opposite. In the Dutch, this is the right way. Like that's, it's a firm rule.
Wow.
Any Spanish speakers here? No. French? No, nothing. Okay. I don't know. Is Mandarin? So, I don't know if you know. Do you speak? You know? No? Okay.
That would be so interesting.
All right. So, right. So the conclusion here is the opposite. So we've seen an argument by Rousseau that leads to this conclusion, and now we have an argument. It seems that Nozick is suggesting that leads to the opposite conclusion. So now we have to choose, right? Note, by the way, like set aside for a moment whatever you might think about Rousseau. Right? You might think, well, Rousseau is full of it anyway, or whatever. Like I didn't like that theory. Whatever you might think. Maybe you love Rousseau. Okay. But if you don't, set aside Rousseau for a second. This conclusion is pretty startling, Rousseau or no Rousseau. Right? Because most people, even before they've read Rousseau, they do think that democracies are somehow free societies. Right? We think about people who are oppressed. Think back a couple of years ago, you had the Arab Spring, right? Like, oh, Arab Spring is this great movement of liberation. What was supposed to be not that they were throwing out the colonizing powers. The country stayed the same. It's throwing out a dictator and replacing it with democracy. And that was supposed to be an enhancement of freedom, right? It's supposed to be moving from being oppressed subjects to free citizens, if you will. And the move was to move from not democracy to democracy. So this is a very popular idea that democracies are free societies, and yet here we seem to have an argument against it, right? That leads to the opposite conclusion, that actually democracies are just as bad. I mean, not as bad to live in, like, because you might get beaten up in one and not in the other, but in terms of freedom, they're just as bad. Yeah, Chantal.
So this, you believe that democracies are not free or not necessarily free?
Yeah, very good question. So this is why I said earlier, like, Nozick doesn't tell you, here's my argument against democracy, knock down, let's move on to something more interesting. So, like, that's not what he's asking you, right? And the reason that he's asking you because a lot of people, probably you, or like some of you anyway, before you took this class maybe, or just in a, at a random moment in the day when you're not reading philosophy or something, right? You think that this is false, right? You don't think that 6 is true. And so what Nozick wants, what he's asking the question, he's saying, well, maybe if 6 is false, maybe you want to really hold on to the idea that democracies are free, maybe not for the reasons that Rousseau says, but just for some other reason. But then we have to find something wrong with his argument, right? Because this is validly leading to the conclusion. So we have to deny one of the 1, 2, 3, and 5. It's possible. So yeah, go on. No, you say first. You go first. I'll tie up in a minute.
Point 1, he has posed a nation slaves, but wouldn't Rousseau's own theory, there wouldn't be slaves because that's not rational or that's not part of their own will?
Yeah, well, Rousseau would accept that in step 1, the slaves really are slaves, right? Because they have a master who puts them in chains and beats them up and so on. So they really are dependent or subject to someone else. Because they're not self-governing. Right? But at the end they're self-governing. And Rousseau thinks we've undergone a change there. Right? So Rousseau will have to say that at the moment that you do get a vote, whether step 8 or step 9 counts as having a vote, it's unclear, but in the moment you do get a vote, freedom is kicking in. Right? Even if, like in the tale of the slave, you're forced into that situation. Right? Like in the tale of the slave, at step 1, you were forced into it because you began as a slave, and it's just devolving into what Rousseau says. But he's okay with forcing you to be free. So, right. Well, so the last thing I'll say. The reason why I think Nozick is bringing this up is that it might be true that we should not believe that democracies are free, that we should believe 6, that democracies are not free. Maybe. Nozick was a pretty hardcore libertarian, so he might go in for that. Although at the same time he believed that living in a state, he wasn't an anarchist, so Nozick himself probably has to deny that some version of living under government can be still compatible with being free. Now, if that's true, right, if something like 6 is false, if you believe that democracies can be free, then something here has gone wrong, right? Well, so it cannot be first. First is just an assumption, right? We're just imagining that. So that, we're just stipulating that to be true. It makes no point to deny that. Just denying the example, like just changing the example, and then you get the same argument going. So we might think that actually there is one step. Maybe it's step 3 to 4, where we turn from slaves into free people, right? Or maybe even if there is no point, in the distinct point at which you turn from unfree to free, over the whole steps, all of which are not enough, all the steps together are enough. Maybe it's like a Sorites type argument, right? Where you say, like 1 grain of sand is not enough to have a heap of sand. 2 grains of sand is not enough to get a heap of sand. 3 grains of sand is not enough to have a heap of sand. But you keep adding grains of salt. At some point you have a heap, right? And there's no point at which we say we move from not heap to heap. Maybe freedom is like that. Anyway, that's the kind of stuff he's asking you to think about. If you're going to believe that living in a democracy is going to be free, then you're going to have to deny one of those steps. Another one, but we'll talk a little more about that next time. Another one is that I think is maybe that Nozick is really drawing our attention to is that it isn't so much that the problem isn't so much with democracy per se. The problem is with how it gets going. Right? It's not what happens once you're in the game. It's not the voting that makes it free. It's the fact that the initiation, the first step, has to be acceptable. So we cannot assume that you're thrown in a democracy and then whatever happens in there will be enough to make you free. It has to be that you yourself accept to be in it or something. So maybe you have to agree to live in a democracy for that to count as free. That's probably closer to what Nozick is thinking. All right. I'll leave it with that. See you guys on Tuesday. Thanks for coming.